4 o'clock, so I will call to order the second monthly meeting of the Hendersonville City Council, April 26, 2023. The agenda is before you. Is there anything you would, any council member would like to add to the agenda this evening? Or a motion to approve it as presented?
Madam Mayor, I move to approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Not. Those in favor of the agenda as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no. Ayes have it. We have our agenda. There are several items on the consent agenda. Is there anything anyone would like to have moved from the consent agenda to the regular agenda so it can be discussed? Or if not, a motion to approve the items on the consent agenda.
Madam Mayor, I move we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Not. Those in favor of approving the consent agenda say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it, and that's taken care of. Thank you. First presentation, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategic Plan. And you want to do an introduction?
Yes.
Or you want, go ahead.
Madam Mayor and members of council, I'd like to invite Bahia Greer up. Bahia is the principal with Akira Consulting, the consulting group that we, City Council hired, and we've been working for many months now on the first phase of this work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have our strategic plan presentation. We did a much smaller presentation to our diversity and equity committee a couple of months ago. Some of our members are here, and we'd like to ask Bahia to come up and make the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you. There is no public comment at this time. She will be coming to the microphone. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manager. Thank you, Madam Mayor, Madam Pro Tem, additional City Council members. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Hopefully this mic works. Let's see if this mic works a little better. Can you hear me? Is that better?
Handheld one's better.
The handheld one's better.
Handheld one's better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So we will get started. Very, very grateful that we are allowed to come and present the many, many months of work that our organization has been able to engage in with representatives of the city, with employees of the city, with stakeholders and community members here in Hendersonville. What you will see this evening is going to be a summary of our strategic plan. Our strategic plan is a very large plan, about 119 pages. We're going to showcase 47 pages of our data and work this evening. So we're going to move at a pretty robust clip. If you have any questions, I don't believe that there's a public comment this evening, but please write down any notes you may have, and we'll get started. All right. So the first couple of pages, obviously you have copies, digital copies before you. We have the contents just to assist in keeping this information outlined. Introduction by myself. Actually, let me go back, because one of the things that really struck us was, I love this quote from Thomas Wolfe, a Western North Carolina native. And when we talk about his quote is, "Perhaps this is our strange and haunting paradox here in America, that we are fixed and certain only when we are in movement." And I think that really does a beautiful job of articulating why this work is so important. We have got to keep moving forward in our understanding of each other, our understanding of our shared histories, maybe our disparate histories, and moving forward in articulating the kind of city we want to have here in Hendersonville. This introduction of work showcases the many hours and individuals that were connected and engaged during this time. We had over 95 stakeholders that were contacted, over 552 consultant hours. Wonderful quote from a community member here in Hendersonville from October of last year, because again, we started back in August of last year, so it's been some time. This is a brief timeline from August until March. Again, our contract goes from August to August, so our work is not done. But this plan does a very good job of assisting us and assisting the members here in understanding what we look like, right? What we believe, what matters to us, our values. So we'll start here with one of the engagements that we held, the Hendersonville stakeholder engagement meetings. And then you have there in the blue at the top an explanation of the purpose and objectives of those meetings. In those meetings, we had responses from over 300 administrative stakeholders. We had 510 responses from community stakeholders. We have short lists of some of the stakeholders that were contacted and that participated in these meetings, and we have some of the themes at the bottom of this page. Some of the themes, and I'll just share a couple of them because we do have so much information to share. One of the themes is that most stakeholders agree with equity and inclusion, but have not formulated a definition of what that looks like to them and to their organizations. That's important to recognize. Both stakeholder groups see Hendersonville as a destination location in North Carolina and wish to increase diversity and inclusion practices for all people and for all people to feel welcome here. This is coming from people that are employed by the city, people that live in the city, people that work in the city, people that spend their money in the city. We also held community listening sessions last August here. And we invited members of the community to come and speak and share their thoughts and sentiments, their complaints. And we also gave community members opportunities to sit within groups based upon their self-identifications. We didn't group anyone. People moved to where they were comfortable. And so some of the identities that were showcased were individuals who, again, are members of the community here in Hendersonville that identified as Latinx, members of the community who, in Hendersonville, were self-identified as religious or people of faith here in Hendersonville, people who self-identified as African American, and members who self-identified as members of the LGBTQ community. These are some of the themes that they raised individually within their self-identified groups. Members of the faith and religious community raised that they believe that Hendersonville is more political than it is religious. These are direct quotes, taking in notes from all of our consultants that held these meetings. Some other themes that were raised. Religious affiliation is oftentimes conflated with political affiliation. Some members of the LGBT community mentioned that recognition and acknowledgement for members of their community is very difficult here in Hendersonville. And they're unsure if Hendersonville is ready to accept all people. What does that look like? How do people feel about that? As we continued with our work, and again, engaging in additional meetings with members of various administrative teams here in Hendersonville. So we conducted an environmental survey, and we had several themes in these particular surveys. One of the themes in this particular category is a work environment. This page just is a very good summation of what we found in our survey, just speaking to the work environment and some of the key findings. One of the key findings I'll just highlight here randomly is interpersonal problems and work conditions were the most common response from Hendersonville employees, along with stress and dullness of their work. Why is this important when we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion? Because a lot of this goes to what people need to do their work effectively. What keeps people in the jobs that they're in the positions they're currently in? Why do people self-separate from organizations? Why would someone want to self-separate from the city of Hendersonville? These are the kinds of information that comes out of this type of data. Another survey category was work culture. One of the questions, how would you describe your current office and department culture? Some of the key findings state that employees find it to be actually a very positive environment. And it was actually a more common descriptor of the current culture, that and growth. Moving on to another survey category, work relationships. One of the key findings is that several respondents disagreed with the statement, and answers clustered around the low end of the agreement part of the scale. And that question was, I work in an environment where everyone shares hardships and successes the same way. I work in an environment where everyone shares hardships and successes in the same way. A lot of respondents disagreed with that statement. They don't believe that they share their hardships and successes the way that their colleagues do. Why is that? First, we have to kind of start with the superficial information before we get to delve into what is it about the environment that may foster or support any type of inequitable sharing of hardships and successes within the work environment. One of the other categories that we were able to engage in was work support. This really spoke to how employees felt about other members on their team, if they felt that they were fully supported with members of their team. And a vast majority of respondents in the city cited a medium or high degree of training support for their particular position. One of the last surveyed categories for our environmental survey was public engagement. One of the questions we asked, do you think that most city residents understand the specific challenges faced by your particular department or office? And almost none of the respondents, almost none of the city employees believed that city residents understood how tough their jobs are. That says a lot. Where is the disconnect between city employees and city residents and understanding the roles and responsibilities here in Hendersonville? Then now we're going to change to another engagement. And all this, again, is to pull out data, pull out data, pull out data. And then finally, we'll get to our recommendations. We engaged in a DEI change growth questionnaire, which is in some ways similar to a SWOT analysis. One of the first categories was our strengths and achievements. And one of the questions was to share something the department does well. Some of the key findings were customer support and teamwork. That's something that really came out of the data and the responses from employees. The next category is current weaknesses. What do city residents say that your department does not do well? Well, some residents complain about the service provision, particularly the speed of service that they receive from city employees. The most common theme was communication. And communication really speaks to how we understand and view and judge each other. One of the other categories, opportunities and areas for improvement. In what areas do you feel your department could use additional training? One of the common themes was people skills, like dealing with inclusion, learning how to deal with conflict, learning how to deal with change, learning how to deal with stress, which affects all of us, right? And the most common theme was leadership and management training. And this, again, is what's coming from city employees. Potential threats was one of the final category. One of the questions was asked, what do you think may cause your department problems in the future? And what came up consistently was staffing and budgetary issues. Top the list. For the next several slides, we're just going to showcase summaries of each individual department. We engaged in a very robust deep dive into every city department. And so we're just going to showcase each one. There are probably, I think, 9 pages of reporting for each individual department. We're just going to showcase one page for this presentation as a kind of a highlighted summary. So the first one we're starting with is administration. And some of the highlighted topics are around hiring, marketing, conflict resolution, and complaint resolution, and then ends with some considerations. And I think I'll just focus on the considerations because there's just so much data here for each department. So for administration, some of the questions that came out of the data and came out of our engagements was, are there any opportunities missed by not having a formal complaint process within the administrative department? And are there other avenues for recruitment besides city council and employee referrals for this particular department? If we're moving on to water and sewer, another question of consideration, how is informal conflict resolution taught, modeled, and managed within this particular department? And are there other avenues of recruitment besides word-of-mouth referrals? If we're moving to communications, one of the questions is, how will the marketing company that's currently engaged with the communications department be replaced? Should it be in-house? Would we consider a new vendor? And are there communities underserved by the high-tech communications policies that are currently in place? And that's something that we actually highlighted in our recommendation section. For the police department, questions. Are there any informal barriers to residents that may file complaints? And how does Hendersonville Police Department present a positive public image as part of its outreach and recruitment? Again, these are just questions and considerations that have come up in summary for each department. And obviously you have copies of the full plan here.
Could you just hold-
Oh, I'm sorry. Obviously, you have copies of the full plan here, and so you can see some of the more detailed considerations that we put for each department. For the finance department, how might the supervisor benefit from more direct collaboration in hiring? And what are other avenues of recruitment besides word of mouth and official announcements? That was a theme that came out a lot, actually, in some of the data that we uncovered. Yes. For the planning department, how do we identify and encourage internal candidates in a fair and equitable manner? And how would we get new residents on board, or maybe even developer buy-in, for a new vision and mission for the city? For the fire department, how would we communicate policies, personnel, and decision-making online for this particular department? And how best to ensure a diverse pool of applicants, diverse pool of applicants as possible in networking and word of mouth and at conferences. Again, additional considerations for this particular department. We're rounding out the end, getting close to it, with engineering. How would residents benefit from an established pattern of communication in the engineering department? Are there stable or commonly requested policies that could be published for this particular department? In public works, what have you learned about hiring as you've collaborated with the human resources department, and how would other departments benefit from those lessons? Are there other avenues of recruitment besides city council and employee referral? And then as we go into the human resource department, absent complaints, how can the HR department proactively identify opportunities to improve? Are there opportunities for recruiting and partnerships with other universities, such as historically black colleges and universities, or other minority-serving institutions when we're thinking about recruitment and outreach? Okay. Again, that was a very high level, a very fast summary of the various departments. Like I said, there's probably about 80 pages that we just skipped over, but I wanted to showcase just the summaries for each department. So we're going to move into the systemic recommendations that we've put together that are based on the data that we just presented. One of the reasons that this is so important to Hendersonville, to some people, this just makes complete sense, right? Why wouldn't we be interested in this? To other members of our community, maybe there's still some reticence. And that's okay. That's okay, that's okay, that's okay. We have identified a couple of priorities that we feel may be important for the city to consider as we move forward in developing stronger, more robust, equitable, diverse, and inclusive policies and procedures. And actually, we decided to break these down into 5 categories just to make them more digestible and easier. We've articulated them as several different cases. So I'm going to show these cases, and we'll go over them one by one. The first one is the moral and ethical case, or DEI. And it's predicated on the belief that the city has a responsibility to care for its people. That's as simple as it is, right? The city has a moral and ethical reason and belief that it's responsible for the care of its people. This includes the specific duty to protect them from any social or systemic or existential harm, that harm being perceived harm or apparent harm. There's a business case for this work. It's related to the effects of employee attrition and reticence on the behalf of prospective job applicants. And evidence that supports, that we have here in the plan, the financial costs of subsequent onboarding, maybe lawsuits, or even employee-resident dissatisfaction. The third case is what we call the recognition case. And that speaks to the desire of the city to be recognized as a top-tier governmental entity, a popular municipality, and a sought-after tourist destination. I think everyone can get on board with that. There's also a regulatory case, and that relates to the legal imperative and the desire to remain cognizant of prevailing federal, state, and local statutes prohibiting, limiting, segregating, or classifying anyone or all forms of discrimination to all persons. The regulatory case recognizes that anti-discrimination legislation often focuses on the impact of policies and associated behaviors and rarely on the intent. Rarely is there affirmative defense of that wasn't our intention. Rarely. Oftentimes, it's the impact that's measured in these types of cases. And then finally, we have the identity case, which I love. It's probably my favorite, the identity case. And that relates to the desire to create a community of shared commonalities here in Hendersonville, celebrated variety and boundless potential. The identity case recognizes the correlation between how Hendersonville sees itself and what type of community Hendersonville creates for itself. And these are the reasons, as we've articulated and outlined humbly, why this work is so important. So we're going to move on to our recommendations. First one, and yes, if you could, thank you so much, Allison. Kind of blow that up to make it easier to read. So everything that you see that was there initially in that screen was the data to support the recommendations below. So we'll just go straight to the recommendations, and we can showcase the data later. One of the, and I think it's important to also recognize that we've created legends in these recommendations because there's so much conversation around the words diversity, equity, inclusion. And there are a lot of different definitions of diversity, a lot of different definitions of equity and inclusion. But rarely do we actually see and understand, I think, in my humble opinion, how these words are actualized. Like, what is diversity in action? What does inclusion look like in action? So we've color-coded these. We've color-coded these to make it easier to understand and digest. So the recommendations are based off of either a principle of equity, a principle of diversity, or a principle of inclusion. So one of the first recommendations we have, I'm so sorry, if you wouldn't mind, Allison, going back to the question, because that actually helps understand. If you just go up on the page, I'm so sorry. Yes. How are residents made aware of the accountability structure and decision-making of your department? Okay. That's the question we're trying to solve or answer. And our recommendations to assist with that. Well, first, from an equity-based or equitable principle-based recommendation is consideration should be given to the steps required to locate information on departmental websites. And we have this recommendation a couple of other times in our plan. Because the question really is, if I'm looking for something on the city planning department or the fire department's website, is the information accessible with minimal website exploration? Does the website information rely heavily on written English text instead of visual imagery, icons and pictures to direct users? That speaks to equity because equity is the easiest way to explain this is that equity speaks to giving people what they need. That's all it is. Very, very simple way of explaining why this is so important. From a diversity-focused recommendation, this same question can be answered. For departments that have no formal structure to inform residents on accountability, consider creation of a visual organizational charts so that people understand who is accountable in the various departments. People respond very easily to pictures and images. If we're assuming that everyone is literate in American English, that is fine. But how many of us have ever gone to a drive-thru at a fast food restaurant? We don't see just text, we see pictures, right? It's a lot easier for us to focus on that and get the information that we need. An inclusive-based recommendation suggests that all forms of verbal communication should consider inter-office practices that inform residents of employees' title and role and explain the responsibility each employee has to address a particular issue. As if a city employee is speaking to a resident, letting that resident know what their role is, what their title is, can go very far in helping that resident understand, okay, I know now that you are accountable to my issue, to my grievance, you're going to get back to me. I also understand that your responsibility only goes so far. And that helps with the lack of misunderstandings that come about in some of our employee-resident communication. One of the things that came up in our community listening sessions from last year, I distinctly remember this, was a resident stood up and said that when he called the city too often with a grievance or a complaint or a question, he was told by whoever picked up the phone that they would get back to him. And his experience was that he was rarely called back. And it was a point of frustration for him because he, at this point, has felt that no one's listening to him. He does not matter. And some of these things, some of these recommendations are really just based off of our aspirations to be great in customer service. That's all, that's what it is, right? I mean, it does definitely has a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to it, but it also speaks to just being great at how we serve the residents here in Hendersonville. Next question, how does your department communicate information to city residents? What platforms do you use? And because we have, I think, 11 or 15 pages of recommendations, I'm going to jump around to some of these pages and just to keep me on time. If you could just make sure that I don't go over. Thank you. So again, an inclusive-based recommendation spoke to the use of imagery and the showcasing of various presenting identities, abilities, and statuses on the departmental social media pages. And that speaks to diverse ages, diverse races, gender identities. An equity-based recommendation, similar to what I already articulated. And for a diversity-based recommendation, for all forms of communication, consider the identities, values, and needs of the residents who engage with the department on each platform. If we have like a departmental Facebook page, and we're looking at the comments that are on the departmental Facebook page, do we see a lot of commonality in the responses? Do we see a lot of homogeneity or groupthink in the respondent populations? And maybe examining ways to reframe the messaging or platform to engage with city residents who are currently unengaged. That's diversity. So in our data, we had some questions regarding the processes that offices follow to receive and respond to resident complaints. Again, even going back to the analogy of the gentleman who continued to call the city and who responds to complaints. So both of our recommendations actually fall within the diversity wheelhouse. And this really speaks to some of the biases that we all hold. And understanding that the biases that we hold are really these cognitive responses that we sometimes utilize to help us negotiate and understand other people in our world. So let's say someone is calling the city with a complaint. And whoever is on the receiving end, the city employee who's listening to the complaint, they're taking down notes. Before they respond back, or before the process is followed, because a lot of departments articulated the responses that they followed to address resident complaints, our humble consideration is that there is a check for affinity bias. We have a definition of what affinity bias is here, a tendency to favor people who share similar interests, backgrounds, and experiences with us. We can also check for attribution bias, which is the perceptual errors that lead to biased interpretations of one's own social world. Or confirmation bias, which is the tendency to pay attention to information that confirms an individual's belief. Why is all this important? Because oftentimes, when we're hearing something that is negative, and that's negative about us, either us personally, us organizationally, us within our department, it's a natural reaction to be a bit defensive. And sometimes that definitely informs how we may respond back. And when we say respond, we're talking about time in responding, how much time is used in the response, the nature of the response, the content, and the context of the response. And so our recommendation with checking for these particular biases is meant to lessen and minimize any miscommunication and misapprehension between residents and city employees. Now we're going to move into interpersonal conflict. That was something that was consistently brought up in some of our engagement questions, and consistently a lot of data and responses from city employees regarding that. So the question is, if I work with you in your department and I really didn't get along with you, what's the easiest way to deal with our conflict? Thank you. So we have an equity and inclusion, we have an equity and two inclusion-based recommendations. And we talk about and define what cognitive bias is. It's a condition in which humans make systemic errors in judgment due to our failure to interpret information correctly. That's a long way of saying just miscommunication, a mistake in what the person was intending to say to us. It's an error of reasoning that occurs when an individual misinterprets information about the world and people around them. And this significantly influences our decision-making abilities and our perceived options for resolution. So there's a lot of cognitive bias that comes into play with interpersonal conflict. And when we're attempting to resolve interpersonal conflict, perhaps we may want to check for the bias that comes out of actor-observer bias, which is a type of cognitive bias that involves understanding the difference between how we explain others' actions and how we explain our own actions. It's almost like when someone cuts you off in traffic. That person's automatically a villain. They're automatically a bad guy. That person automatically didn't know what they were doing. They're automatically at fault. But we did nothing wrong, right? That's how we see ourselves. That's an example of the actor-observer bias. And where we're dealing with interpersonal conflict in our office positions, the acknowledgement that that's a possibility goes very, very far in helping us understand and work with each other. And all of this is really meant to help bring in new and interesting and, I like that word too, competent is very good, individuals into the city employment. We're going to bring new ideas. We're going to bring new experiences. They may support some of our established policies and experiences, and they may desire to change some of that. And that's okay, because we have residents who are coming in the city every day, right? New residents into Hendersonville every day, and they're coming in with their ideas and their culture and their expectations, and we need to be responsive as city employees to that. One of the questions that came up regarding purpose, mission, and values, core values of our various departments. About 50% of the departments had their own definition and their own standardized mission or core value statement. About 40% of the departments relied on the city's definition, and about 10% had nothing. They had no idea what this was. One of the questions that was asked talked about how could we either create, reframe, or restructure these statements. And so the recommendations here, two of them are diversity-based, one's inclusion-based, really spoke to the codified purpose, mission, and value statements of each department. One of the recommendations was that each statement should acknowledge underrepresented populations, both within the department, like employees, and the external Hendersonville community. Hiring and onboarding, another big theme. Who in your office does the hiring? Who does the onboarding? Again, we bring in some information regarding various biases, like attentional bias, which occurs when an individual's perception is influenced by selective factors. This is a tendency to focus on a particular piece of information, like, oh, this person went to the same college I did, or, oh, I know your cousin, while ignoring additional information contained within an application, like, is this person competent for the job? Does this person have the experience for the job? This happens. This happens to all of us. And it's okay if we recognize that we are engaging in some form of attentional bias, as long as we can check for that. To assist in the process of hiring from an inclusive framework when interviewing new applicants, consider the pervasiveness of the halo effect, which is the tendency to be influenced by one's initial impression of an external feature of another. And that's something that our society does a very good job of. We put a lot of value on the way that a person may look or a way that a person presents him or herself. Initial impressions can be established from these superficial presentations and from reputational information. And all this goes back into how we bring people into our community and into the employment, and then who actually comes and trains and helps them become acclimated into various departments. We had some data and engagement regarding documentation of the interpersonal interaction. A lot of conversation surrounded interpersonal interaction within our various offices. One of the diversity-based recommendations was that within the city's HR personnel policy, we consider an actionable policy instead of an inactive statement of acknowledgement, which is really, really important. as opposed to just having a statement of, we acknowledge that there are various types of people and various types of identities or something to that effect. Have a policy that really speaks to what we are doing. Because that's action, what we're going to do, or what we engender to do. This policy should be its own separate, inviolable, standalone policy that employees understand and represent to be a priority of the city and places value on engineering behaviors that support diversity, equity, inclusion, and not simply as statements of belief. And one of our other recommendations was to actually have this actionable policy in a conspicuous place on the city's Human Resources website and the Employment Opportunities page. And then the inclusion-based recommendation really spoke to us mirroring who we are. If this is in fact how we see ourselves as a city. Again, these are things that we as a firm highly suggest for consideration, but it's ultimately up to the city to decide if they're going to adopt it. So for example, consistent interpretation of the policy's language would consider additional dimensions of diversity that reflect the values of the city of Hendersonville, such as sexual orientation, familial status, political affiliation, socioeconomic status, and veteran status, saying that yes, we value these identities and they matter to us. Outreach. Is it possible for a person to hear about a job opportunity with the city outside of the ways mentioned earlier? We can see some of the data that was captured from that question. The diversity-based recommendation really just spoke to another way of critically examining this challenge is asking ourselves, how can we create a community that values various individuals of these various intellectual, social, and cultural varieties with limited opportunity to connect these people? Our inclusion-based recommendation suggested developing a pipeline for this type of diverse talent, starting with maybe entry-level or junior employees, and sponsorship and support by ERGs, which is another word for employee resource groups. They are groups of employees within an organization that get together, they support each other, they create resources for one another to make their jobs more efficient and effective. One of the questions that we had was, how do residents receive information regarding your departmental policies and departmental rules? And in what form can a resident receive information regarding your departmental policies and departmental rules? We have 2 equity-based recommendations. Again, really just spoke to, and some of this is slightly similar to what we mentioned earlier regarding accessibility of information to residents with any kind of assistive technology needs. How do they locate this information? And consideration should be given to expanding communication beyond spoken and written English. Referrals. How do referrals originate within your office? We have an inclusion, diversity, and an equity-based recommendation here. We spoke a little bit about affinity bias, which is a tendency to favor people who share similar interests, backgrounds, and experiences, and how that may ultimately underlie each referral and then contribute to entrenched homogeneity within the workforce. So let's think about that. If I know someone, I'm likely to know someone that shares my background, my experiences, or my interests. That's just how we are, right? And if I'm going to recommend, if I know of a vacant position here in Hendersonville, and I have a friend who either shares my experiences, backgrounds, or interests, and I love working for the city, I'm going to say, hey, there's a great position here opening up at Water and Sewer. You should apply. Okay, that's the first step. Now, that person's job application is put in. That application is reviewed by a manager. Now's the next step. How is the manager looking at the information that's provided? Is there a tendency to pay attention to information that confirms an individual's belief while ignoring information to the contrary? Because now the manager knows that I've put this person in. They know referrals are open, right, in the city. The manager knows that I, as an employee, have recommended my friend. Manager is now going to read the application from my friend, and what information are they going to pay attention to is very, very important. That speaks to confirmation bias, the tendency to pay attention to information that confirms an individual's belief. They know I'm a very hard worker, I'm a nice person to be around, my friend's probably a very hard worker and a nice person to be around. And we also have a process here that if I recommend an employee to the city and they are hired by the city and they stay on for, 12 months, that new hire receives a bonus and I receive some type of monetary compensation. From our data and our research in that, we're not saying that's ill-advised, but we're also saying that we should consider that if we really want to create an intellectually, racially, experientially, and culturally diverse workforce, we should give examination to assigning any type of unmerited value to candidates based upon established circles of familiarity. Because if I know someone that shares my backgrounds, beliefs, or experiences, and then that person recommends someone who shares their backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences, and that person refers someone who shares their backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences, pretty soon we're going to have a room full of people who all have the same backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences. And we're supporting that by some of the process that we use to support that, assigning monetary value to people that are hired based on that, may put us in the place that we are now. We wake up and wonder, wow, there's a lot of sameness in this room. There's a lot of familiarity in this room. And if we're looking at ways to kind of disrupt that and examine that, then we have to examine policies like that. They were probably created with the best of intentions, absolutely created with the best of intentions. But what type of impact and where does that leave us as a city? All right, so one of the additional recommendations, this next section, is the recommendations for future leadership, efforts, and resource allocation. So one of the requests in the city's RFP was the creation of an employee-led DEI leadership committee. So we've outlined in these pages here, and if we could just go back, please, to the, thank you so much. Here on these pages is really our outline of what the framework could look like and probably would likely look like for this particular committee. So we have the purpose and membership information. We have the goals outlined for this particular committee to protect and celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion through a variety of mechanisms, including workshops, social gatherings, cultural events, trainings, to foster a work environment that is respectful of inclusive communication. This committee would make suggestions to city administration that support, educate, and discuss issues like this, and this committee would facilitate communications between and among all staff. And again, what differentiates this from other committees who may be similarly situated is that this isn't a committee solely made up of leaders and staff members within the city. These are all city employees. These are some of the responsibilities that we have recommended. This committee can set and review measurable DEI objectives and actively monitor progress against some key performance indicators that are actually, the key performance indicators are listed in our strategic plan. We just didn't have time to get to them today. This committee will assist and review the commitment of the DEI commitments, purpose, and goals. They'll act as DEI ambassadors across all forms of city government and coordinate and help co-coordinate the overall DEI program, and they will provide feedback to city administration because, again, some of the members of city administration will be in this committee. Additional responsibilities to identify opportunities for the city to engage with the broader community and to promote DEI efforts. And they will also conduct self-assessments each year of committee effectiveness that describes the accomplishments of these developed goals, in addition to some others that are listed here. One of the other things that we were very, very happy to assist the city with during our work over these past almost 9 months so far has been the development of theory of action. We have here just an explanation of what a theory of action is. It's a hypothesis about what will happen when we have a set of strategies that we ultimately implement. It's a process of connecting what we plan to do with what we hoped to get. And then we explain why it's so important for us to create a theory of action. It actually helps us develop a core approach to hold the strategies that we put together. So we created a proposed theory of action for the city of Hendersonville, and I'm going to present it now on this screen. I'll leave it up for you to read. If we desire to appreciate the rich and varied history of our city, and if we wish to champion opportunities for all residents to thrive, and if we also value the lived experiences of community members and the perspectives of our neighbors, then we must support initiatives that lead to a high quality of life for all community members, which results in a community government collaboration that retains generations of residents and welcomes new ones, which then results in a city that people take ownership of and are proud to call home. There you go. This final page is a page that recognizes the many, many hours of commitment and work on behalf of our consultants, of Akira Legal and Diversity Consultants, and more importantly, actually, the members of the city who have really welcomed us, who have been extremely, extremely receptive and very, very flexible and gracious with all of our many, many requests for their time and information over these many, many months. And so that concludes the information in our presentation this evening, and I would love to know if anyone has any questions.
Questions, anyone? I think we got this yesterday, so we haven't had a chance to really digest all of it, but appreciate the overview that you've given us this evening. Any questions, anyone?
What are the next
Yeah, I was
steps
gonna say, what's the
after
next-
this?
Yeah, what's the next
I get
step?
that question a lot. Okay, so thank you for that question. Based upon the scope of services outlined in the RFP, after this is reviewed and adopted, by the council, we will begin our series of community-based workshops in the city over the next 3 months. We're currently in the process of putting together the timeline and scope of that, but we will have probably our entire team of consultants in the city every month, leading and directing and working with community members in these workshops. The themes of these workshops are actually going to be based upon the data information contained in the strategic plan, which is why it was so important for us to create a robust and comprehensive plan for the city, really a plan that the city of Hendersonville deserves, because it's just an amazing place, amazing place. And so the themes will be pulled out of the plan, and we will be with the community in engaging in this work. So, yeah. And that should end, everything should end in August of this year.
Great. Anything else?
Okay, all right.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
For being here and for the presentation. Well, Mr. Connor, do you have anything you want to add to this at this
Just-
point?
Just thank Bahia and her team for her work, and our team who has been very engaged. It's been amazing to hear from our staff who have interest in these topics, and particularly some of our younger staff who appreciate the fact that we're asking these questions and having these conversations. Folks that are that we've been able to attract into Hendersonville and in the community, that are very professionally minded, and just appreciate their efforts and the work that they do, and appreciate the efforts of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee who have asked us to take a look at this work and the community in general, and to hear from all residents of our community. I attended some of the focus groups and really I had heard bits and pieces of history from members of our community, and I didn't fully understand where their perspective and where they were coming from, just from a historical perspective, because I had my own thoughts about what certain things meant, whether it be terms like urban renewal or things about how there had been past interactions that I had a perspective, but my perspective was different in the perspectives of folks in the room that we had the focus groups. We've also heard about members of our community who lived in subset communities, whether it be Black Bottom or Brooklyn or Peacock Town or West End, and understand their living history and why their perspective is different than my history. It's been really interesting, and I think it's allowed us to have some great conversations within the community and build. I hope we're building strong relationships, and I think that's important because we do have a lot of interaction with people in this room, people in the community. It's important for us to understand each other, and so I just appreciate this, and I appreciate the leap of faith that the Diversity Committee took when we brought the idea of bringing in a consultant instead of just hiring a DEI staff member without any plan, without any idea of how to move things forward. That if we were going to move, our community forward, we needed to have this plan, have this, something to shoot for, right? These goals, these focus areas. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of uncomfortable conversations. It's a lot of, we have to be willing to stretch ourselves a little bit, and I just appreciate the work of Bahia and her team and my team and the citizens that have participated, because we can have differing views, and they are difficult, uncomfortable conversations. Absolutely. They will continue to be difficult, uncomfortable conversations. We just have to accept that in doing this work. But if we're going to move the community forward, this is the kind of work we have to do. If we want to recruit great industry, they're expecting us to have these difficult conversations. If we want to recruit great team members, they're expecting us to have these conversations. We can say we shouldn't have them, but this, in reality, if you talk to anyone under the age of 35, they expect us to have these conversations. And if we want to recruit these folks and bring them and make our community, this is a long game. This is about setting our community up for success for the next 50, 100 years. While again it's uncomfortable, I feel like it's what we need to be doing, is having the conversations and learning from each other. So, thank you.
Thank you. Right. Let's take a couple minutes break. If anyone would like to leave before we go on to the rest of our presentations, you may do that.
Let's get ready for Graphomania.
Oh, I love graphs.
Oh, I'm telling you, you got to see a lot of graphs.
No, we lost you. He's hiding behind you. Okay. All right. Okay, so next we have Stantec presentation on the 2023 Water and Sewer Rate Study.
Yes, indeed. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. As Councilmember Smith knows, we have a lot to go over this evening, so I'm going to jump right in. But I am talking about the rate study results and recommendations. And in terms of our agenda, it's a lot of information tonight, so feel free to jump in with any questions as we're going through each of the topics. I think that's can be helpful to address those. But I'm going to go a little bit over the rate study process. If you remember back in October, I was here to talk about the initial steps of the study and kind of provide some background. But today we have the results. I'm going to talk about the financial plan, the cost of service results, the rate structure analysis. Then we'll look at bill impacts. What does this actually do to customers? We'll talk about system development fees and then wrap up with the recommendations. So real briefly, just to put it into context, in terms of there's really 3 steps in the rate study. The first is the financial plan, which defines how much revenue do we need on the system. The next step is defining from whom. So based on what it costs to provide service, how do we collect that revenue, from whom? And then the final step is the rate study, rate design, which is how you collect it. So how do you actually structure the rates? And so I'm going to go through each of these topics, the first one being the financial plan. And the approach that we use to come up with a financial plan is we're building a 10-year financial model. So we look at revenue requirements, which is essentially the cost of operating the water and sewer systems. We looked at that over a 10-year projection period. And that includes operating costs, it includes future capital investments, it includes existing debt service you have to pay off for prior investments. We then compare that next to a revenue forecast. So we forecast your revenues based on your current rates, changes in system demand, number of customers. And when we compare your expenses versus your revenues, we can then look at some key metrics. Are your revenues sufficient to meet your revenue requirements? Are you going to stay within some cash targets that you've set? And do you meet your debt service coverage requirements? So that's kind of the overall process. So jumping into the assumptions, we do have to make some financial assumptions. So the first is from an operating expenditure standpoint, we're using the fiscal year 24 budget as the starting point for modeling. And then we look at each of those line items and we escalate that forward using inflation. On average, we're using about 3% per year to escalate those forward. Capital expenditures include your existing debt payments. Just to give it context, fiscal year 24 is about $3.9 million in a debt service payment coming due. We also incorporate your 10-year capital improvement plan, which we'll talk about in a minute, and that's funded with both cash and debt. And then on the revenue side, when it comes to non-rate revenue, so turn on, turn offs, miscellaneous fees, things of that sort, we're using the 24 budget, assuming that's flat over the 10-year projection period. We are using conservative assumptions for customer growth, so 0.5% inside the city, 1% outside the city. In total, that's about a little bit less than 0.9% annual growth in customers. And then the user rates are really the kind of the solver in the financial plan. Here's the 10-year capital improvement plan. Totals $292 million. You can see year by year the expenditures and then the types, whether it's equipment, rehab and replacement of the existing system, or expansion in blue. You will notice that there's a big number out in 2033 of $85 million. That's really 2033 plus, so some additional future years. In all likelihood, you're not going to spend $85 million in 2033. But in total, it is a significant capital plan. And so now here's where we get into some of the details in terms of the graphics. This is the panel from the financial model. And I just wanted to kind of orient you first. So if we look up at the top, this scenario is assuming that there's no changes in rates. So as we go across the top, we're looking at fiscal year 24 through 33. We're assuming no increases in rates. And then below that, we have one of those metrics that I was talking about, which is your debt service coverage. You have 2 tests, test A and test B. And essentially, this number here needs to be 1.0 or greater every single year. So that's an important metric to consider. And then down below, down here in the bottom, we just have some informational graphics. So this is the cash balance within the fund. So you can see we have a positive cash balance starting, but it is going negative in the future. This graphic just shows your cash in to the fund, which is black. Here's your cash out, which is the orange line. These are the types of expenditures, operating, debt service in purple, and then some transfers. And then down at the bottom is just the capital. So the total plan, how we're planning to fund it, whether it be debt or cash, and then these are the borrowing amounts. And so again, this is assuming no rate increases. One other assumption here is that we're assuming in fiscal year 27, you're only executing your CIP at about 80%. Historically, it's been around that number. And so we want to be realistic in terms of what you're actually going to execute in the plan. Couple things to note though, with this plan, with no rate increases, it's real obvious that your cash in is significantly less than your cash out. And so what's happening is you're depleting your cash balance. You'd can be completely out of cash by fiscal year 25, and it would go just more and more negative. And so also, finally, you would fail your debt service coverage calculation. So again, that needs to be 1.0 in fiscal year 2024. And so clearly, no rate adjustments with the current capital plan and with the increases in operating cost doesn't work. So just want to show that as a diagnostic. So the next slide here shows these are rate plans that you've talked about in the past. So in the past, you've talked about 12% increases in water going from fiscal year 24 out to 2030, and then inflationary increases at 2%. And then also you've talked about 7% on the wastewater side. And again, under this scenario, we're assuming 80% execution. What we noticed is that our cash balances would be fairly low. They're depleting, not to the point where they're negative. But the biggest issue is that we would fail the debt service coverage in 2027. And so ultimately, we're recommending a modification to this plan instead of the 12s and the 7s. So that's essentially what's shown here. So this would be, again, assuming 80% project execution. These are the proposed increases. So in fiscal year 24, we're proposing 11% for water, 12% for wastewater. And then we think you're going to need similar increases at that level going forward throughout the projection period out to 2030. Our cash in and our cash out are well aligned. You will see in the outer years that we are building up some cash. And so it may be that we could tail off on some of those increases in the future years or cash fund more of the CIP. But most importantly, you are meeting that debt service coverage in each of the years. And so just to wrap up the financial plan, revenue increases from rates are required in fiscal year 24 to meet that debt service coverage calculation. If you don't meet that, essentially your bond covenants say that you'd have to have another rate study done to tell you what you need to do to raise your rates. So you do need to make some adjustments. We're recommending the 11% in water, 12% in sewer. The customer bill impacts that we'll talk about in a little bit are going to be varying based upon the rate structure recommendations that we've come up with. But future revenue increases will be required at similar levels. We don't think you can just do this one-time increase. You're likely going to have to continue to do those 11s and 12s. But as a policy, the city evaluates this on an annual basis, so we would recommend to continue to do that based on how capital spending occurs and growth and things of that sort. So that's the financial plan section. Next, we move into cost of service results. And what this section does, it looks at how you're recovering cost from your various customer classes. I guess first off from by service, water versus sewer, and then by customer class. And we just want to make sure that we're collecting the appropriate amount of revenue by each of the services and by class. And so that's ultimately the goal. This is a little bit different in that we're not looking out at a projection period. We're looking at a test year. So we use fiscal year 23 as our test year. And the first observation, this shows the by service type. And so what this graphic shows is in white is the revenue requirement for water on the left-hand side, and then the revenue requirement for sewer on the right-hand side. And then in orange is the revenue that you generate from each of the services. So what you'll notice is there's a little bit of a misalignment between the two. You're over collecting a little bit on the water side and under collecting on the sewer side. It's only about 3%. We've seen much, much worse, but it is something that we think you should address going forward. And so if you remember back, I'm recommending the 12% on sewer and the 11% on water. This would help you balance that going forward to get these into alignment. And the next step in cost of service, because you have different customer classes for water, we look at how much you're generating from each of the customer classes, so single-family residential, commercial, irrigation, municipal wholesale schools, and bulk water. And then we looked at what it costs to serve each of those classes. And this gets rather technical. We're looking at the actual peaking, how they peak the system. So residential customers tend to have higher peaks on the system, which can cause you to incur more cost because they're irrigating, things of that sort. But what we found here was that you're actually very closely aligned, probably one of the closest we've ever seen in terms of the revenue collection by class and the cost. There's a little bit of a slight over collection in residential, slight over collection in commercial, industrial, irrigation's a little bit under, but overall it's very close. So just to wrap up the cost of service section, again, there is a modest misalignment between water and sewer cost and the revenue that's generated between those services. It's about 3% of revenue. We are recommending that you do balance that over time, and the financial plan that I've laid out with the 12s on sewer, higher than the 11s on water, would essentially rectify that going forward. Your customer class cost of service is very closely aligned with the recovery by class, but I am going to talk about some rate structure modifications here in a minute that would help align that to where they would be actually, I don't want to say perfectly aligned, but would bring them to where they should be. So that is cost of service. The last section here is the rate structure alternatives. And so here we're talking about pricing goals and objectives. First off, just how do we actually look at how we collect water and sewer rates, things of that sort. And so the first one we want to address is customer affordability. We want to make sure we can offer the service at an affordable price for the minimal quantities of water. We want to have rate and revenue stability, and what that essentially means is that we don't have tremendous volatility in the revenues year over year coming into the utility, as well as we don't have significant one-time rate adjustments to customers. We want to align with the cost of service results that I just talked about. We need to be able to communicate the rate structure, and you need to actually be able to bill it, so that's an important. And then ultimately, we need to comply with industry standards and legal requirements. So just a quick background in terms of how you currently charge for service. So these are your current water rates. You have base charges, which are scaled by meter size, inside and outside. And these base charges are what are charged regardless of use. So if you're out of town, you pay these base charges even if you don't use any water during the month. And then when we get to the volumetric rates, you have different rate structures for each of your customer classes. So for your residential customers, you have what's called an inclining block rate. So the more you use, the more expensive it becomes as you step through these tiers per 1,000 gallons. And commercial side, you have what's called the declining block rate. So the more water you use, the cheaper it becomes per 1,000 gallons. Irrigation is a two-step inclining block rate, and then for municipal wholesale, bulk water, and public schools, they all pay the same per unit rate or per 1,000 gallons that they utilize. Then on the sewer side, it's a little bit simpler. You also have base charges that are scaled by meter size. Again, you pay these regardless of whether you use any water or not, or return sewage. The volumetric rates are simpler. They're just per 1,000 gallons, and they do differ. Oops. And they do differ based on customer class and location, inside versus outside. Okay, so that's the background on the rates that are in place today. We have developed some recommendations, and there's three main areas that I want to talk about. The first is the water and sewer base charges. We are recommending that you increase the portion that you collect in those base charges a little bit by about 2%. And essentially what that does is that just helps you continue to move towards having that revenue stability. So if you think about it, the more you have on those base charges, the more guaranteed revenue you have on the system, so the less volatility you see in the revenues. And then we're also just recommending that you scale those consistent with industry standards. There's published standards on meter equivalents. Essentially, the larger meter you have, the more water you can pull in the system, and it just scales them appropriately from that standpoint. And then when we talk about residential and irrigation water rates, just a couple of modifications we're recommending. The first would be to modify the tier quantities and the differences between the pricing. And essentially the first one would be to create a lifeline tier. So that would be a new tier at the lower end, and that would increase customers' bill control, so they can control how much they're paying. If they can stay within that quantity, also provides affordability. And then we're also looking at the differentials, so how much more the cost goes up when you go between the tiers to help align with conservation. That's one of the things we saw in the cost of service results, was we were off a little bit on the irrigation. And then finally, I know this has been talked about in the past, the commercial and industrial water rates, we'd recommend going to uniform rate fiscal year 24. So commercial industrial would pay the same regardless of the amount of water they used per unit per 1,000 gallons. So what this looks like for the base charges, over to the right is your current base charges, and then to the left is how we came up with the recommended base charges for fiscal year 24. And we do look at it in two components. We're not recommending necessarily you would publish it in this manner. These are the totals that we would recommend being published, but essentially we look at the administrative costs, so meter reading, admin, things of that sort. And we're not recommending that you scale those costs based on meter size. That's the same regardless of whether you're a big meter or small meter. It doesn't cost any more to read the meter or to do the billing. But when we get to the readiness to serve component, which is the fact that you have to have facilities ready whether somebody's using them or not, that's where we're recovering the cost based on scaling by meter size. So just hypothetically, if you're a small single-family home with a 3/4 inch meter, you can't demand nearly as much water on the system as somebody who has an 8-inch meter. And so you have to be proportionally ready to serve that greater quantity, and that's the whole theory behind the scaling. One other item to mention is that consistent with the plans that you've talked about in the past, you do have an inside-outside differential on the water side as well as the sewer side. On the water side, you're gradually stepping that down. And so that differential in fiscal year 24 is going to 130%. It was 135% currently, and that's just being stepped down. So now I'm going to talk about the volumetric rates, and the first one, as I mentioned, a lifeline tier. And essentially this would be the addition of an initial quantity of water for basic indoor water needs, so for cooking, cleaning, sanitation, things of that sort, and it would be priced at a lower rate. And what we did to come up with the quantity in that tier was we looked at the census data for single-family homes. It's 2.31 people per household in Hendersonville. And then we used efficient water use defined by the Residential End Uses of Water Survey at 37 gallons per day per person, and that equates to a lifeline tier of 3,000 gallons. And so again, this would be a quantity that's just indoor water use. So what this looks like in terms of the structure, so up at the top is your current tiers for residential customers, so tier 1, 0 to 6, 6 to 14, and then 14 and over. What we're recommending is splitting that first tier into two, so you'd have your lifeline tier from 0 to 3, then 3 to 6, 6 to 9, and then your irrigation would really be in tier 4. And so what this looks like in terms of the actual rates are shown here. So the only real change on the residential side would be adding that lifeline tier, and then you can see how it scales up based upon the amount of water that's used, and it would provide that enhanced conservation as we're moving that tier down. Instead of starting at 14, it now starts at 9. On the commercial side, we're transitioning to that uniform rate, so regardless of how much you use, it's the same rate, no longer a declining block rate. And then on the irrigation, it is enhanced irrigation, so this is a higher multiplier than before. And then if you use over the 40,000 gallons, it would be $10.52 instead of the $10.02. And then no change to the municipal and bulk. They're just increasing based upon the revenue needs in the system. That's the water side. Sewer side, the changes are pretty minimal. We did the exact same calculations, again, collecting a little bit more in the base charges, breaking it down between the account charge and the readiness to serve charge, totaling them up to give you your recommended base charges inside the city and then outside the city. And these rates, base charges and the rates, volumetric rates, will generate that 12% more additional revenue in fiscal year 24. So volumetric rates, again, no change, just essentially increasing them to make up that additional revenue that we need on the sewer side. So now where the rubber meets the road is what does this do to bills in terms of bill comparison. So I've got showing this in a number of different ways. The first one would be just a real simplistic look at an average monthly bill for a single family home. And so right now for electricity, on average, it's about $150 per month for a single family home. Cell phone, this is what's published. I mentioned this the other night. It seems a little bit low. I know my home pays more than $105 for cell phone service. Current inside city bill for somebody using 3,000 gallons is $50. Outside it's $71. With the recommended rates in 2024, it'd go to $53 inside city and $75 outside city. The North Carolina average as it stands right now in 2023 is about $60 per month. So that's the simplistic view. Now we get into the real detail. And the reason that we need to show it in this manner is because anytime you change your rate structure, it's going to impact somebody's bill depending upon how much water they use. And it could, 1 month if you use a lot of water, this rate structure would have more of an impact versus another month. And so what we've essentially done here is we took a full year of actual usage data for every single account, and this is just residential, single family, and we applied the new rate structure to it. And so what this essentially shows is the number of bills and how they change by each of these categories. So again, this isn't total number of accounts, this is actual total number of bills. So with the water rate structure that we're recommending in fiscal year 24, if you apply that to the usage and assume people use the same as they did the last year, you'd see about 253,000 bills that would see between a $2 and a $1 decrease over their current bill. And then as you move to the right, you'd see about 52,000 bills that would see a $1 to $4 increase, and then 4,000 that see between a 4 and 7, and then all the way down the scale to where you'd see 180 bills that would pay $100 more. And obviously those are the irrigators, but again, these are bills, they're not accounts. So somebody could be out here 1 month and they would, down here another month. But this provides a full picture of how it would impact customers. I think that's really important to see. And then as we look at the next one, this is commercial customers. Again, under the new rate structure, we did the exact same thing. There's fewer commercial customers, so there's not as many bills. But the vast majority would see between a $0 to $50 per month increase in their water bill. And again, these are just water bills. Whereas about 95% of the bills would actually be between $0 and $25 more per month. And then as you scale to the right, there are some customers that use a lot of water. And so percentage-wise, it's about the same percent, but dollar-wise, it looks like a lot. There's 112 there on the end that would see about a $1,000 increase in their water bill.
112 bills.
112 bills, correct. Thank you.
$1,000 over a period of what time again?
1 month.
In 1 month. Yep. And the staff, we've provided the full bill tabulation so they can look at every single customer and see who these customers are and how they're impacted. Yep. And so then the final component here is industrial customers, and these, again, there's even fewer of these. These are the number of bills. 35 would see between $0 and $50 change in their water bill. And then you do have 10 out on the end that would see $1,000 change.
So these are a total, like if you took all the accounts and you multiplied them by 12, one per month. So it's like $9,000 every month. It would be.
No, it is. So this is taking the data and looking at how people use. This would be, there are 10 bills that would go out that would be $1,000 more than they're currently paying.
Every month.
No.
Just that 1 month.
Just that 1 month. Okay. Okay. We're saying the same thing. I got you now.
No, but this is the collection of 1 year's worth of bills.
It is.
Right.
Yep.
So this is for the whole year. There would be 10 bills that would be $1,000 more. 10 monthly bills.
Right.
Yep.
Not 10 customers who get $1,000 more every single
Correct.
month for a total of 12,000. Yeah.
Correct.
And it wouldn't be 10 months of $1,000 more. It would,
Right.
in essence, it would be singular,
Yeah.
10 different bills that went up
Yep.
$1,000.
Yep.
Okay.
That's a good point. Yep. And you do have some customers that use a lot of water, and so they're paying really high bills to begin with. So even if it's $1,000 in that 1 month, it's not, as a percentage of their total bill, it's not a huge percentage change. So I have another way to look at it, and this is just, these are now just samples. So this is just sample residential monthly bills, 3/4 inch. So this is the vast majority of your customers that are single family, have 3/4 inch meters. These are inside the city. And what I have to the left is just scaling usage. So if you use 1,000 up to 20,000, this is what your current bill is, and this is what the bill would be with the proposed fiscal year 24 rates, the dollar change, the percent change. And then now we're bringing the sewer bills in. So this is the sewer bill, current, proposed, the dollar change, and then the percent change, and then bringing it all together for the total bill. So a lot of your customers do use around 3,000 gallons. So they would see a modest decrease in their bill there. They'd see the increase in their sewer bill. And again, this is taking somebody from that bill that was combined of about $50 up to $53 that I showed on a prior slide. If you're an irrigator and you're using 20,000 gallons, you could potentially see, a pretty significant increase in your bill. This would be a $42 change in that month, at about a 17%. You don't have a lot of customers that use that quantity of water, and you certainly don't have them that use that quantity of water year-round. You do have irrigators that in the summer months they'll use greater quantities of water, but again, the vast majority are in the 5,000 to 6,000 range.
Question, because this kind of it affects my household, but when someone is irrigating, right, they're using copious amounts of water, but not necessarily contributing to the copious amounts of sewer that they're also being billed for. So how does that factor in? Because I know, like at my house, like my water bill this month was like $350 because we had to fill a pool, but then it's directly correlated to the sewer. And so we're not utilizing the sewer to fill a pool. So I guess the irrigators are in the same kind of boat because they're adding water, but it's not contributing to a sewage increase. So how does that factor into a bill that's fair?
Well, I think there's a number of considerations. So one, you have a lot of water-only customers that you're serving, and they get sewer serviced from the county, I believe, with those other customers. And so you're right, in terms of if you have water and sewer service, you are charged based upon the amount that you use. There are communities that cap sewer bills based upon certain things of that sort to try to address that. There are communities that have irrigation meters, separate meters that meter just the irrigation quantities, things of that sort. But this is the pretty typical approach in that it's based upon your water use. And so it is, I guess, essentially an added incentive to conserve and make sure you're using water wisely. But there is no mechanism right now that I'm aware of outside of getting a separate irrigation meter that would allow you to address that. I know there's communities also that if you are filling a pool, you can call in and say, I'm filling the pool. You can have somebody come out and verify it and not have to pay sewer charges on those. But I don't believe that's currently in place.
Thank you.
So then outside the city, this is calculation here, where again, we're looking at the scaling based upon how much you use, what the current bill is, what the proposed bill is. And you'll notice that there are more reductions in water bills on the outside city, and that's because of that differential going from 135 to 130% differential inside to outside city. And so that is coming into play there. Over to the right, though, you can see the current typical bill, about $71, going up to $75 for a customer using 3,000 gallons outside the city. So final bill comparisons, just looking at some surrounding jurisdictions and comparable utilities. You can see the current inside city bill where you stand right now at that about $50. The average amongst these utilities is about $53. So with the proposed rates, you'd go up to that average for inside city, and then outside city is currently the $71 and $75. So at the higher end of the range on the outside city. And again, this is just for a residential, single-family, 3/4-inch meter. Next slide shows for a commercial customer. So you can see a commercial customer currently inside city where they fall in comparison to the others. With the proposed rates, they'd be going right up to the average of about $750 for this customer who has a 1.5-inch meter and uses 60,000 gallons per month. And then you can see the current and proposed outside the city. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears. We can come back to any of these topics, but now I'm going to talk about system development fees. And these are quite a bit different. What we've been talking about thus far are ongoing charges that customers pay for the operations and maintenance of the system and capital investments. System development fees are one-time charges that are charged for new connections joining the water and sewer system. You can also charge them when a customer requires additional capacity. So if you're doing a rebuild and you go from a 3/4 inch meter up to a 2-inch meter, you could charge system development fees for that increase in capacity that they need. The purpose of the system development fees is to cover at least a portion of the cost of building water and sewer capacity. So the idea that growth pays for growth. The fees do need to be applied based on units of service. So you charge a higher system development fee for a larger customer than a smaller customer. And finally, these fees are legislated in North Carolina. The System Development Fee Act was passed in July of 2017. So there's very prescriptive guidance in terms of how you have to calculate these, how you can use the revenues, things of that sort. So just some considerations real quick in terms of the system development fees. So they do allow a community to recover at least a portion of the cost of constructing infrastructure. If you think about it, you have to build the facilities before somebody can join the system. If you don't have system development fees in place, the cost of infrastructure falls back on the users of the system. That's really your only funding source. One con with system development fees is it does potentially have an impact on development, but I will say that they are extremely common in North Carolina. Most of the communities surrounding Hendersonville have them, and they're very, very common across the state. As I mentioned with the legislation, there are requirements and limitations on how you can use them. You do have to track them separately, and you can only use them for capital type investments. You can't use them for operating costs. So the legislation outlines 3 different methodologies that you can use to calculate system development fees. The first is the buy-in method, which basically looks at what you've invested historically, and that would typically be used by a community that doesn't have, has ample capacity to sell in their system. The flip would be the incremental cost method, which would say we're going to set these fees based on what we have in our CIP because we're out of capacity to sell. And then the combined method is what we're recommending and what we've calculated for the city, and that's looking both backwards and forward. You have some capacity to sell in the system, but you also have plans to expand the system. So this is what the calculation looks like. I won't go through the gory details, but essentially there's very, again, prescriptive methodology that you have to use. You really have a numerator, which is the value of the system. So we look at the historical investments that have been made, bring those up to current dollars. We look at what you're adding in the CIP in terms of future capital. The legislation does require us to take out some credits, so we have to take out the outstanding principal on debt because that's paid for through user rates. We also have to credit against the capital projects, at least 25% reduction there. And then these fees can't include donated assets, so things that you didn't pay for, or non-core system assets, so vehicles, equipment, computers, things of that sort. And then ultimately you divide by the capacity that's in the system plus what you're adding to the system. So I have the calculations here. Maybe this provides a little bit more guidance in terms of how it actually comes together, but essentially this is just the water system development fee calculation that we've come up with. This is the total value that we've identified, about $200 million. So that takes the historical investments plus the expansion CIP. And then from that, we have to take out those credits that I talked about, which gives us a net system value of $121 million. We then divide that by the capacity in the system. So your current capacity at 12 MGD plus that 6 MGD in your CIP to expand the water treatment plant. And that essentially says that we could serve 65,000 equivalent residential units, or essentially single-family homes, which is the divisor into the value of the system and ultimately gives us our system development fee for water. So about $1,800 per equivalent residential unit, which is on par with a single-family home for water. And we do the exact same calculation on the sewer side. You have a smaller sewer system, so the value is a little bit less. We're coming up with a net system value of about $90 million. With the wastewater treatment plant expansion, you'll be up to 7.8 million gallons per day of capacity, which means there'd be about 28,000 ERUs that you could serve, equivalent residential units. And that gives us a calculation of about $3,000 for a system development fee on the sewer side. So that we then take those, and as I mentioned, we do have to assess system development fees based on units of service. So the most common approach is to take that base ERU and then scale it based on meter size. It's by far the most common approach across the country as well as in North Carolina. And these equivalents are same equivalents that we use in the base charges. So it essentially says that an 8-inch meter is equivalent to, would be 93 3/4-inch meters, the capacity that you could draw on the system. And so bringing it all together, again, we calculated the 3/4-inch meter at the $1,800 for water, $3,000 for sewer. That would give us a total of $5,000. And then we would scale that based on meter size. So if you're joining the system and you have a 4-inch meter, under this approach, it would be about $100,000 in system development fees. We have included the number of meters just to give you a sense for the number of meters you have in the system by each type. So you have a very few that are at those larger levels. You don't have any 8-inch meters. And then these are customers with water and sewer service, so the number of associated on the sewer side. I should mention that these fees that we've calculated are the maximum that you could charge. You couldn't adopt fees any higher than these, but you could adopt fees that would be lower than these. So if you determine that you wanted to set them at 75% of these calculated fees or 50% or anything of that manner, you could. You just can't go higher without another study that would justify them being higher. So this is how you compare to some of those similar utilities. So right in the middle on the water side at that $1,800. Across North Carolina, the average is about $2,000 for water for a system development fee for a 3/4-inch meter. And then on the sewer side, a little bit higher in the range, but again, across the state, it's about $3,000 is the average. Amongst this comparison group, it is a little bit higher on the scale. So I did want to just run the model one more time and just show you if you were to adopt the system development fees as we've calculated them, and if you were to have the conservative growth that we included, which is a little bit less than 1%, 0.88%, that would generate about $750,000 in system development fee revenues on an annual basis. And again, I think that's a conservative number given the modest growth that we're factoring in there. And if you did adopt them and kept the current plan, that would obviously allow you to build up some more cash, which we would need to set aside in a separate capital fund. But ultimately, this would give you additional dollars to address the capital improvement plan. You could use that specifically to retire debt, to cash fund capital projects. And ultimately, if you were to adopt them in future years, I believe you could back off of some of those rate increases to some degree, depending on the level of growth. So again, this would be another source of revenue. You're building this infrastructure ahead of people joining, and it's a way to recoup some portion of that. And so with that, recommendations are pretty straightforward. Again, we think that you need to increase your revenues in fiscal year 24 to make sure you meet your debt service coverage. We're recommending the 11% revenue increase in water, 12 in sewer. The rate structure changes would include a little bit of an increase in the base charges, the amount you're collecting from them, aligning the scaling factors. We are recommending modifying the volumetric rates for residential customers to add that lifeline tier and enhance conservation. Going to the uniform rate on commercial industrial, as well as the enhanced conservation on irrigation rates. And then we would recommend that you at least consider the adoption of system development fees. Again, they're very common. It does take some of the burden off of your existing ratepayers. They're having to fit the bill right now, and it would be an appropriate thing to consider. So with that, I'll take any questions, and I can hop back through the presentation if there's anything. Yes.
On the slide that would be 2 slides prior to this, where you showed kind of the revenue model with the system development fees, is that revenue model factoring in the rate increases in water and sewer, or is that just system development fee changes?
No, this does. This says we go ahead with the plan that we've talked about, and you add system development fees on top. You would just be building up excess cash that essentially would allow you to pay for capital investments. And so we didn't come back and say, well, let's lower the rate plans, which we could model. Mm-hmm. That's essentially how it would play out in our. And I do believe developers are very common. System development fees are very common to developers. They're used to having to deal with them across the state.
So when you talk about the residential system development fees, if it was multifamily, then you would multiply, right?
Generally, the way it would work, there's two different ways. You could do it based on number of units as an alternative to this, or you could do it based, if it's a master metered multifamily, you could do it based upon the meter size. So if they come in, they need a 2-inch, then it would be equivalent to this. There are communities that scale it based on number of units, and I know we were going to talk with staff about that as well. So did I miss anything from the other night?
No? And I think you put some new slides in there, a couple of ones.
Yeah, there were a few
that they were
clarifications.
missing, yeah.
Yep.
So you updated some of that information. And Mayor, that's the exact question that was asked Monday, the question you just asked.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's no more questions.
Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, David.
All right. Special appropriations.
Actually, Mayor, if it pleases the city council, we will postpone the special appropriations and do that at your meeting next week and just do the tap water branding.
All right.
As it relates to time. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Members of the City Council, Adam Sturr, Utilities Engineer with the Water and Sewer Department. So we have a great utility logo, but we do not have a logo for our tap water yet. Oh, thank you, sorry. So think of brands and logos, you can think of, Microsoft, Apple, and Laura Lynn. Those are all trusted brands. But we don't have one for our water department. So we wanted to push that through, and I guess I wanted to go ahead and, the reason doing this project, I'm taking a part of a transformational water leadership academy through the American Water Works Association, which is a multinational water professional organization. So this is the first year that they're offering this leadership academy that is focusing on the social, environmental, and financial utility issues across the nation. So there's 50 utility professionals across the nation and Canada that have been selected to participate in this academy, and I'm one of them. It's funded by an EPA grant, and this was our first meeting in Atlanta about a couple months ago. So this is my capstone project coming out of this academy. So tap water consumer confidence concerns, this is definitely a hot topic right now. You have PFAS and emerging contaminants, lead service lines. There's also been a few recent water system failures, Flint, Michigan, and in Jackson, Mississippi, that have kind of tainted the consumer confidence in tap water, as well as misinformation from some of the environmental groups and other media. So it's definitely a topic, and it's important that consumers are having confidence in their tap water, which from recent surveys has been declining. This is a survey of a few thousand folks nationally, and the question was asked, how do you view the water that comes from your faucet? Looks like about 72% thought their tap water was either very safe or somewhat safe, but the remaining 28% of the survey either thought it was unsafe, very unsafe, or really didn't have an opinion, which is a little troubling. That's a lot of people when you think of all the people that are consuming tap water. And the alternative to tap water is for drinking is these filling stations or bottled water, which is way more expensive than tap water. Here's a few examples. So the Primo bottle filling station on the right, that was actually a photo taken in the Mills River, Ingalls. You can see their price up there is about $1.40 a gallon. And then it kind of goes on for bottles. Aquafina, $1.89 a gallon. And then Fiji water, which is, takes a lot of transportation expense, obviously, is $10.52 a dollar, while Hendersonville tap water is less than 1 cent per gallon. And a lot of folks will say that, bottled water is great for convenience, which it is, but these water filling stations are quite curious because you have to take the effort to go to the grocery store with your container, fill it, and then take it home. So that's rather inconvenient. So why we want to brand our tap water, a couple items I touched on earlier. So building that consumer trust and confidence in the product, as well as using it as an education outreach method to improve the understanding of the value of water. Also for affordability, we saw the price of the alternatives previously, and there's a lot of studies that have shown that lower income and minority customers are more likely to purchase bottled water from filling stations than higher income and non-minority customers. Also, we just saw from a previous presentation that rate increases are coming for our system, as well as I would say just about every water and wastewater system across the nation. So consumers are, more likely to agree to paying those rate increases when they know they're receiving a high quality product. Also on the environmental concern, reducing waste through plastic bottles, transporting those bottles. There's definitely a bigger environmental footprint, that comes from that. So part of the process for this branding was we held one focus group session with a variety of utility staff, engineering department. We had some maintenance and operational folks from the water department, some folks from the finance department as well. Just kind of throwing out ideas about, what do they think of when we talk about Hendersonville tap water, what adjectives, what logos, what images come to mind when those come up. And one of the big things we talked about a lot was the history of our water system. And so we've got some great newspaper clippings from, this would have been about 100 years ago, 1922, 1923, when our greater water system was being constructed. So there's some these old newspapers are super entertaining to read, but there's some really great adjectives in there about, even one said this is the greatest project the city has ever done in 1923. And they were even talking about fire insurance rates back then in 1923 as well. So definitely a good thing. And mountains were a big adjective and describe with that, when those papers, because that was the source, was the Pisgah Mountain Range at the time and still is. So here's the logo that we've came up with, the focus group came up with, and we really wanted to kind of have the logo resemble our greater utility logo, so we kept the same mountains, and then bringing in the stream coming out of the mountains into the tap, and then put Hendersonville at the top just to kind of brand the logo a little bit, to keep it to Hendersonville. And mountains on tap. Good.
Swag?
What's that? Yeah, we're still going.
Swag?
So how will we use the brand? So we'll be making some swag. We've got some water bottles we plan to make, and these will be great for some giveaway events. We had the Hendo Earth Fest last weekend, and we gave away a lot of our older bottles, so it's time for some new ones. We'll also give these away at our treatment facility tours. And we plan to make some decals of the logo to place on some of the water bottle filling stations at public buildings, and try to get them out into the schools, and really anyone that has one of those pieces of equipment, or at a water fountain, that they can just kind of show where their water came from. And then social media campaigns and posts. Here's a couple renderings of conceptual renderings of some of the swag we'll produce. Biggest thing, I think, is the water bottles, and those will be a great product that we can show that off and give those out. Yeah, so that's the presentation. Wanted a special thanks to Brandy, Heatherly, and Allison Justice, as they were really instrumental in doing the creative portions of this branding. But with that, I'll open it up to any questions or take suggestions from there.
Well, one thing you mentioned Monday night was the fact that the water bottles would be clear.
Yes,
As opposed to green ones, just to show off, you know,
correct.
water is crystal clear.
That's right. Yeah. So the water bottles we produce, big important part is it's clear. You can see them. So hopefully, here in a couple months, we'll have those bottles, and you'll see a lot of you have you can maybe drink out of them at future meetings, and that'd be great. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
I love it. It is so cool. You've got to be really proud of yourself. That's a
Yeah.
really neat project.
Yeah. No,
And
it's
I think
great.
it's great for the public to see this.
Thank you.
And I didn't mention this Monday, but, you know, certainly in the city, I don't think there would be a problem, well, I say that. At the schools at least the new ones that have the water bottle dispensers, to put that sticker on there
Yeah.
somewhere, just to let the kids know that, like, this is really good drinking water to
Yep.
drink it.
Yeah, that's one of our areas we'd like to proceed with, is getting into the school filling stations. Some places, Louisville, Kentucky specifically, they've done a similar tap water branding campaign, and I believe it might be Louisville, I think town of Louisville law, that any public building that's constructed has to have a water bottle filling station. And they do a more robust branding, like they have, like, you know, it's not just a decal you would slam on it. It would be more wrapped and a little more professional. But, you know, that's certainly something, you know, at least in the city, that we could consider for all new public buildings to require that. But something neat that Louisville did, I think.
But I would agree with you that most people don't recognize how good our water is. As Lee Smith said, I never drink water out of a bottle. I don't need to. So, oh, sorry, Lee, you're there. No, I remember when I first met you, we were at a meeting, and somebody handed you a bottle, I said, I don't need that, I'll just go get it out of the tap. And I said,
Yeah.
hey, you got it, that's what I'll do, the same thing.
Good.
Yeah, I have my grandsons convinced that this is the world's best water. I've just got some glass bottles in the refrigerator that I keep refilling, and they come in, oh, this is the best water, Grandma. I said, yeah, it's right out of the tap.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then, you know, those bottles, you know, Louisville and other places, you can just sign up and, you know, they'll ship a bottle to them if you'd like one. So we could do something similar to that as well, and make those available to the public if they want them and miss some of the giveaway events.
Maybe we send it, since water sewer rates are gonna go up. Here's a water bottle.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? Everybody loves free swag in their mail, I'm just saying.
Do we have a place at the Apple Festival where you can refill your water bottle?
That's a good question. I'm
Because
not.
that would be a great way to market that.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, some of the larger utilities have a water station that you can rent out for events, and it has their branding on it. But you know, these are bigger utilities. They're expensive, but yeah, I'm not sure if we have how that works at the Apple Festival. I'm sure folks do get thirsty up there.
Sorry, John, I'm sorry.
Yes.
That's a great idea.
I'm just saying, with that
Hook it
logo,
up to the fire hydrant.
yeah,
Yeah.
that logo, and give away water bottles and fill it up right here,
Yeah, that's a great idea.
that's the
Yeah.
great, great,
Yeah.
propaganda, for lack of a better word, right there.
We can look into some options on maybe providing that at the Apple Festival, and that'd be a good way to get the bottles out.
You really don't know what you've gotten yourself into.
Yeah, I know. I'm kind of.
That Academy's did its job.
Thank you, Adam.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We are at the end of our agenda, so we are adjourned.